Good evening. I was working through a stack of submissions this week when this particular script made me set everything else aside. The detail that stopped me was not the betrayal in plain sight, but the protagonist's first move after he recognized it. Not rage, not a confrontation, but a quiet decision made over a glass of untouched champagne. You're watching His Eternal Diary.
The first thing Marcus Thorne noticed was the smell of gardenias. They came from somewhere beneath the layered perfumes of 200 guests, beneath the caterer's warm brie and the faint electrical heat of the gallery lighting that had been rented for the evening and installed along the east wall of the Whitmore Club's grand reception room. Gardenias. A specific, almost aggressive sweetness. The kind that made the air feel dense. He noticed the smell because Vivian was allergic to gardenias. He had learned this in the 7th month of their relationship, when he'd sent a bouquet to her office and she had called him from the hospital lobby with a voice like dry paper, trying not to sound as frightened as she was. After that, he'd kept a mental note. No gardenias. He'd told the florist tonight. He'd told the event planner twice. He stood at the edge of the room now, champagne glass in his right hand, and looked toward the long arrangement of flowers on the far wall, which was Dansiu. Correctly, white roses and eucalyptus, and nothing else. The gardenias were not from the arrangements. He followed the smell with his eyes because he had always operated that way. Locate the source, identify the variable, assess. It was how he'd built Thorne Capital from a 2-man advisory firm operating out of a converted loft in the financial district into an asset management company that controlled north of $4 billion in institutional client portfolios. It was how he'd passed the bar at 24, earned his CFA at 26, and quietly restructured the inheritance mess of 3 different family estates before he turned 30. He was 34 now. He located things. The gardenias were from Vivian's wrist, not a perfume. An oil, the kind applied in a thin line at the pulse point. He had never bought her gardenia oil. He had never bought her anything gardenia adjacent because he had the allergy logged the way he logged everything, in the mental spreadsheet he kept on every person who mattered to him, the cells filled with preferences, aversions, and information that might one day be useful or protective. He stood very still. Across the room, Vivian was laughing at something Portia Hale said. She was wearing the dress they had chosen together. Pale gold silk that caught the warm lighting the way water catches sun. Her dark hair was up, and the diamond pendant he had given her 6 weeks ago hung correctly at her throat, which was the detail he had expected to notice. He noticed it. He noticed also the bracelet on her left wrist that he had not given her. He had almost given her that bracelet. He remembered the afternoon with a specificity that surprised him even now. A Thursday in February, 8 months ago, when he'd walked into Ferretti & Sons on Mercer Street because his assistant had forwarded him the jeweler's lookbook after he'd mentioned wanting to find something unusual for Vivian's birthday. He'd sat with the older Ferretti brother for nearly 40 minutes, examined the limited-run collection, and held that bracelet in his hands. Platinum setting, 4 interlocking bands, with a single sapphire clasp offset to the left. He'd put it back. He'd chosen instead the Astor cut bracelet in white gold that Vivian had admired in a magazine. He'd left Ferretti's without buying the platinum piece. He knew that bracelet. He knew the exact way the clasp sat. He knew the price, $12,400. He knew the production number, 14 pieces, global. He had not bought it. He raised the champagne glass slowly to his lips and did not drink from it. Vivian caught his eye from across the room and smiled. And it was a real smile, bright and warm, and he smiled back. He had always been a very good smiler. It was a technical skill, like parallel parking or reading a balance sheet, and he had practiced it early in his career because he understood that people needed it from him, needed to feel that warmth was available somewhere inside the architecture of his competence. He held the smile until she turned back to Portia. Then he let it go. He turned and walked slowly toward the east wall, where the bar cart was stationed, and he set his full champagne glass on the edge of a high table and picked up nothing else. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides and considered what he knew. He had not bought that bracelet. His mother had not bought it. His assistant, Elena, handled all gift logistics and would have informed him. Vivian's parents were in Scottsdale, semi-retired, and her father's taste in jewelry ran to turquoise and silver. Her friends, Portia, Margot, Dee, were all present in this room, and none of them operated at the level of a $12,000 Ferretti piece. There was one other person in this room who operated at that level. Julian Ashford was standing near the window with two of the investors from Thorn Capital's most recent fund close, laughing in his particular way, one hand gesturing loosely, the other around a glass of single malt. Julian was 37, the COO of Thorn Capital, Marcus's college dormitory neighbor, and later his most trusted operational partner. Julian had a reputation for taste. He wore a Lang & Söhne on his wrist and kept a winter apartment in Verbier. He sent wine to clients at the correct moments, and he knew what the correct moments were. Julian knew Ferretti and Sons. They had been there together, actually, 2 years ago, when Julian was shopping for a gift for his then-girlfriend, Fenderay, who was now his ex-girlfriend, who had ended things, according to Julian, because she found him emotionally unavailable. Marcus looked at Julian now from across the room. Julian was laughing. Marcus thought, 8 months ago, February, he had visited Ferretti's on a Thursday afternoon. He had held that bracelet, put it back, and left. The following Monday, he had been in Chicago for 2 days for a board meeting. Julian had covered the New York office. Julian had known, because Marcus mentioned it, that he was searching for a birthday gift for Vivian. 14 pieces. Global production. He did not go toward Julian. He did not go toward Vivian. He excused himself quietly from the east wall and walked through the side corridor of the Whitmore Club, past the coat room, and into the small anteroom that the club used as a secondary waiting area. It was dim and cool and smelled of old wood and the faint residue of cigarettes from a generation when smoking indoors was still a feature of rooms like this, rather than a ghost of them. He sat down on one of the leather chairs. He placed both hands flat on the tops of his thighs. He thought, how long? Not in the tortured way, not with the burning behind the sternum that the question deserved. He asked it the way he asked questions about market positions or contractual ambiguity, with the specific intention of answering it. How long required a timeline? A timeline required data points. He began, quietly, to build one. The bracelet was from Ferretti, that he was certain of. He had held it, he had studied it, and his memory for objects was precise. The collection had been produced 14 months ago. It had been available in-store, and by appointment for 6 months before selling through. Julian had the knowledge base and the spending capacity. Marcus had visited Ferretti's in February, 8 months ago, which meant the bracelet would still have been available. Opportunity window confirmed. He thought about the gardenia oil. He had not bought it. He had never bought it. Vivian had not worn gardenia anything in the 3 years of their relationship. And he had specific cause to notice. The hospital lobby, her dry paper voice, the way she had tried not to sound frightened. But the oil tonight was deliberate, applied to the pulse point. Someone had given it to her and she had worn it here. She knew she was not allergic to all gardenia preparations. She had clarified this once, carefully, in the way she spoke about things that embarrassed her. She had said, the heavy florals, the pollen, fresh gardenias in large quantities. An oil diluted, at a single pulse point. She had tested it, she'd said. She was fine with it. She had smiled when she said this, almost apologetically, and he had filed it away without attaching weight to it at the time. She had tested it. For whom? He had never encouraged it. He had never shown interest in gardenia as a fragrance. He breathed in slowly through his nose and out through his mouth, and thought about the engagement party happening 40 feet away, and the 200 people in it, and the catering bill, which was sitting at approximately $19,000, and the custom invitations, and his mother's flight in from Boston, and the ring on Vivian's finger, which was a round brilliant of 2.4 carats set in a delicate pave band, which he had also, like everything else, chosen carefully. He thought about the shareholder structure of Thorn Capital. He thought about the shareholders' agreement that governed it. He thought about the paragraph in that agreement that he had negotiated at the time as a personal protective measure, because he was the kind of man who protected himself with paperwork even in moments of optimism. The paragraph read, in relevant part, that equity transfers to immediate family members upon marriage were permissible, but required 30-day advance notice to all existing shareholders, a simple majority vote, and a specific carve-out that he had included at the last moment, at his attorney's suggestion that read, "Transfers pursuant to marital arrangements are subject to modification or revocation at the sole discretion of the founding shareholder in the event of demonstrable breach of fiduciary duty, moral turpitude, or conduct materially adverse to the interests of the firm." Moral turpitude. He had never expected to use that language. He had included it the way a careful person includes insurance, not from pessimism but from the discipline of considering variables. He sat in the anteroom for 6 minutes. He knew it was 6 because he counted internally, one of those habits from the early years when he'd had to manage his own anxiety in meetings before he learned to redirect it into something useful. At the end of the 6 minutes, he stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked back into the reception room. He spent the next 3 hours being, by every observable measure, an excellent host. He spoke to the investors. He spoke warmly to Vivian's parents, who had flown in after all, her mother having changed her mind about the trip at the last moment. He danced once with his own mother, who was 71, and still moved well, and who said quietly against his cheek that Vivian looked beautiful tonight. And he said that she did, because she did. He watched Julian from a distance, in intervals, the way you watch a market position you're preparing to exit. Julian was at ease. Julian was always at ease. It was one of the things Marcus had valued about him in the early years. Julian's ability to hold a room without effort, to smooth the social surfaces that Marcus sometimes left inadvertently rough. Julian had been useful. The past tense arrived in Marcus's mind without drama. Julian had been useful. Night, he watched the way Julian moved through the room without looking at Vivian. That was the tell he had been waiting for. Two people who were not involved would exchange the natural glances of two people who both loved the same man in different ways, one romantically, one as a close friend. They would make eye contact across a room. They would smile. They would at some point gravitate into a small cluster of conversation. Julian and Vivian did not look at each other once in 3 hours. Not once. He had watched carefully. At 11:45, when the evening was winding and the last of the guests were collecting coats, Vivian found him near the east wall and took both of his hands and said, "We should get home. I'm exhausted in the best way." Her eyes were bright from champagne, and she was radiating a happiness that was not performed. He could see the difference. He had always been able to see the difference. This was the part that was genuinely difficult. She was not entirely performing. Whatever she was doing, whatever had happened between her and Julian, and for however long, she had managed to hold some portion of real feeling for Marcus, too. He could see it. She was not a sociopath. She was a woman who had done something catastrophic and had not, apparently, made a decision about it. And that ambiguity was its own kind of information. He squeezed her hands and said, "You looked beautiful tonight." She smiled and pressed her forehead briefly against his jaw. He looked over her shoulder at Julian, who was getting into his coat near the entrance, and Julian looked back for a single flat second, and then looked away. Marcus thought, there it is. In the car on the way home, Vivian fell half asleep against his shoulder, the platinum bracelet visible against her pale wrist in the passing streetlight. He looked at it once. He did not look again. He spent the night in the same bed, which required a level of self-management he acknowledged was significant. And he slept, because he had trained himself over years of high-pressure work to sleep when sleep was strategically necessary. In the morning, he rose at 5:15, as he always did, and by 5:30 he was at his desk in the study, which was separated from the bedroom by 2 solid doors, and he had opened his laptop. He had an encrypted folder on his system. He had maintained it for years, originally for deal-sensitive documentation and personal estate planning. He opened it now and created a new subdirectory. He named it Thorn Capital, Restructuring. Then he opened a second window and composed a brief email to Patricia Sung, who was the managing partner of Hargrove and Sung, the most highly regarded corporate and estate law firm in the city, and who had been Marcus's personal attorney since he was 29. The email was 4 sentences. He requested a private meeting at her office, not at Thorn Capital's, at her earliest availability. He noted the meeting was personal and time-sensitive. He noted she should not confirm via his office line or his assistant. He sent it. He sat for a moment, listening to the building around him, the hum of the HVAC, a distant elevator, the city beginning its low rumble outside the triple-glazed windows. He thought about what he was going to need. He was going to need proof of the relationship, or at minimum enough documented circumstance to render the situation legally unambiguous. He was going to need to move quickly on the equity structure before any marriage-triggered transfer provisions became active. He was going to need to understand Julian's financial position at the firm with a granularity beyond what the standard quarterly reports provided. Specifically, Intoray, he was going to need a forensic-level review of Julian's expense reporting and discretionary transaction authority over the past 3 years. He was also going to need, at some point, to make a decision about the engagement itself. He had not made that decision yet. He understood that this might seem strange from the outside, that a man who had just determined, with reasonable certainty, that his fiancée and his COO were involved, might not immediately know what to do about the engagement. But Marcus had always understood that the right timing of an action was as important as the action itself. Moving wrongly now would cost him leverage. The shareholder agreement provisions he intended to invoke required specific procedural sequencing. The forensic audit of Julian's accounts would require Marcus to act, from Julian's perspective, as though nothing had changed, for as long as the audit needed to run without alerting Julian to its existence. Their confrontation now would be satisfying in the way that certain market exits were satisfying, the release of a held position. But it would also contaminate the process. Julian and Vivian, alerted, would have time to consult lawyers of their own. Julian would potentially begin moving assets or destroying documentation. Vivian might make claims about the engagement period that complicated the equity transfer provisions, if any were already in motion. He needed to know what was already in motion. He opened a fresh document. He began to write. Patricia Sung's office was on the 31st floor of a building that smelled, in the lobby, of new carpet and circulated air. Marcus arrived at 7:40 for an 8 o'clock meeting, which was early enough that the lobby was quiet and the elevator was his alone. He wrote it up watching his reflection in the burnished steel doors, suit correctly pressed, tie correctly knotted, face giving nothing. Patricia was already there. She was always already there. She was in her late 50s, with cropped silver hair, and a way of occupying a room that reminded Marcus of certain judges he had appeared before, a quality of absolute, unhurried precision. She poured coffee from a vacuum flask rather than the firm's kitchen setup because she had preferences about temperature. She poured Marcus a cup without asking. "You said personal," she said, "which means I should not assume this is about the fund restructuring." "No," Marcus said. "Sit." He sat and told her what he knew. He told her methodically, in the order he had established the information, and he did not insert emotional commentary. He told her about the bracelet and why he was certain of its provenance. He told her about the gardenia oil, and the 3 hours of Julian and Vivian not looking at each other. He told her about the company's shareholder agreement and the specific language he wanted to discuss. Patricia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the cup in her hands. "How long has the company been structured this way?" she said. "The current agreement has been in place for 4 years. The equity transfer provisions I mentioned were added in the most recent revision, 18 months ago." "Who drafted the revision?" "Hargrove and Sung. You supervised." She nodded slowly. "The moral turpitude language was Elkins's addition, I believe. He was being cautious." "He was right to be." She set the cup down. "Before we discuss the structural elements, I want to understand your evidentiary position. You have circumstantial indicators, the bracelet, the fragrance, the behavioral pattern at the event. That's not nothing, but it's also not a signed affidavit." "I know. What are you asking me to secure?" "2 things initially. First, I want a forensic accounting review initiated on Julian Ashford's transactions within Thorn Capital, his expense authority, his discretionary accounts, and his personal benefit arrangements. I want it framed internally as a routine regulatory compliance review. We have a fund audit scheduled in 6 weeks, which provides cover for a pre-audit internal review. And second, I want you to prepare the documentation necessary to invoke the moral turpitude provision and revoke any pending or prospective equity transfer to Vivian Cole with full legal defensibility." Patricia looked at him steadily. "If the forensic review finds nothing irregular in Ashford's accounts, your ability to justify the revocation on fiduciary grounds weakens significantly." "I understand that." "Which means you're betting that the financial irregularities exist." "I'm not betting," Marcus said. "I'm operating from available data. Julian Ashford has been running at a lifestyle level that has, over the past 18 months, exceeded what his compensation structure should reasonably support. I noticed this because I notice things. I attributed it initially to an inheritance from his uncle's estate last year. But the uncle's estate was valued at approximately $1.2 million, and Julian's behavior pattern suggests a liquidity level above that." Patricia absorbed this. "You think he's been taking from the fund?" "I think there is a non-trivial probability that Julian Ashford has been structuring personal benefit through the firm's discretionary transaction accounts, and that this predates his involvement with Vivian Cole. I think it is possible, not certain possible, that one of the reasons the involvement with Vivian Cole exists is because she is positioned to become a shareholder upon our marriage, and a shareholder who is not paying close attention to what the COO does with discretionary accounts is a useful person to have in the structure." The room was very quiet. Patricia picked up her pen and drew a single line across the top of the yellow legal pad in front of her. "When do you want the forensic team to begin?" "Monday morning. I'll send Elena a scheduling note that frames it as pre-audit prep. She'll route it normally. So, Julian won't see the mandate scope because it will be structured as a compliance engagement initiated by outside counsel. Standard language." "Who at the firm knows anything about this?" "No one." Patricia nodded. "All right." She wrote something briefly on the pad. "I'll have Elkins begin drafting the revocation documentation in parallel. It won't be filed. It'll sit in reserve until you tell me to move it." "Correct. And the engagement itself." Marcus looked at her for a moment. "The engagement continues for now." She did not react. She had been a lawyer for 30 years. "Understood. One more thing." She set the pen down. "I want you to be honest with me about something that has nothing to do with the legal strategy." "Go ahead." "Are you doing this because it's the right structural move, or are you doing this because it gives you something to focus on that is not what you actually feel about what happened?" He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the cup of coffee she had poured him, which he had not touched, and which had cooled to the temperature at which coffee becomes merely a thing in a cup rather than something useful. "Both," he said. She nodded as though that was the correct answer. All right. I'll have the engagement documents held in parallel with the revocation filing. If you change your mind about the engagement in any direction, you call me first. I know. He left at 8:47. He walked the 16 blocks back to the Thorne Capital offices because he needed air that was not filtered or temperature-controlled. The city in the early morning was different from the city at any other hour, less performed, more functional, people moving with the specificity of people who had somewhere to actually be. He walked among them and felt nothing particular, which was either a sign of exceptional self-management or something he would need to examine later. He chose not to examine it later. He arrived at the office at 9:20, which was normal, and said good morning to Elena, who was managing his calendar with the quiet efficiency she had maintained for 6 years, and he walked past Julian Ashford's office, which was adjacent to his own, and Julian was inside, on the phone, and Julian raised a hand in greeting through the glass, and Marcus raised a hand back. Then he sat at his desk and opened his emails and began his day. The forensic accounting team that Patricia engaged was Meridian Review Partners, which operated out of a nondescript office in Midtown and specialized in exactly the kind of quiet institutional forensics that required discretion above all. They were introduced into the Thorne Capital system under the pre-audit PrEP framing, and their lead, a man named Devlin, who wore the same gray suit every day. Marcus saw him and had the eyes of someone who had found things in ledgers that changed people's lives, began on the Monday as planned. Marcus told no one. He went home each evening and had dinner with Vivian, who was in a good phase, energized by wedding planning, by the positive response to the engagement party, by some project at her firm that was going well. She was a senior associate at a design consultancy, and when she was engaged in work she found meaningful, she had a particular quality of aliveness that Marcus had originally found one of the most compelling things about her. He watched it now across the dinner table and felt the double awareness of a man who is seeing something clearly for perhaps the first time. That she was real, that she was not entirely performing, and that none of that changed what she had done. The platinum bracelet disappeared from her wrist after the second evening. He noticed its absence the way he had noticed its presence, without comment, filing the fact. In the third week, Devlin requested a meeting. They met not at Thorne Capital and not at Hargrove and Sung, but at a rented conference room in a business center that smelled of synthetic carpet and printer toner. Devlin had a laptop and a printed report in a plain folder. He set the folder on the table and opened it. "We found 3 structures," Devlin said. He had a Midwestern flatness in his voice that Marcus appreciated. No drama. "The first is a series of expense allocations through the firm's client relations account that were classified as entertainment and development costs, but do not correspond to any identifiable client interaction. Over 31 months, the cumulative figure is approximately $420,000. Marcus kept his face neutral. "Classified by whom?" "Ashford holds sole classification authority on that account. The review threshold for secondary authorization is $5,000 per transaction. The transactions were structured below $5,000, individually, in all but 3 instances, and the 3 instances above threshold were approved by the former CFO, Marlene Briggs, who left the firm 19 months ago." "Briggs left to take a position in Hong Kong," Marcus said. "She did. We've noted that." "What are the other 2 structures?" Devlin moved to the next page. "The second involves a vendor relationship with a firm called Kessler Advisory Group, which has been receiving monthly retainer payments of $8,000 for 36 months, classified as ongoing research and analysis services. We could find no deliverable, no contract, and no individual at Kessler with verifiable credentials in the relevant area. The firm's registration address is a mail forwarding service in Delaware. Ashford controls that vendor relationship." "He has sole approval authority on it, yes," Marcus said. "And the third?" Devlin looked at him with the expression of someone about to deliver the most structurally significant piece. The third is more complex. It involves a sub-entity, a holding vehicle called Meridian Parallel Holdings, which is not to be confused with Meridian Review Partners, my firm. He paused, almost apologetically. The name similarity is coincidental. Meridian Parallel was registered 14 months ago in Nevada. Its registered agent is a corporate formation service, but the beneficial ownership, when traced through a series of nominee arrangements, terminates at a name we identified through cross-referencing a prior tax filing that was improperly redacted. He turned the folder so Marcus could see the page. The name was Julian Ashford. Meridian Parallel Holdings, Devlin continued, is listed as a co-investor in a real estate development transaction in which Thorn Capital is also a participant as a limited partner. The LP agreement was entered 14 months ago. The development is a mixed-use project in the Red Hook corridor. If the development completes on its current trajectory, the projected return to limited partners is between 18 and 22%. Marcus was very quiet. Ashford's entity, Devlin said carefully, entered the same LP agreement at a subordinated position, but with a co-investment kicker that was negotiated with the development's GP outside of the primary LP terms. That kicker, which is buried in a side letter that was not disclosed to Thorn Capital's other principals, entitles Meridian Parallel to an additional 4% of the upside above a 15% return threshold. He closed the folder. He used insider knowledge of the fund's investment, Marcus said. He used his position and knowledge of the fund's due diligence to enter a personally beneficial co-investment through a concealed vehicle, without disclosure to or consent from the fund's other principals or its investors, under standard fiduciary duty analysis in a registered investment advisory context. I know what it is, Marcus said. Devlin nodded. I'll have the full report delivered to Miss Sung's office by end of week. There will be supporting documentation for each of the three structures. The total exposure, conservatively calculated, is in the range of $1.4 to $1.8 million, not including the undisclosed kicker. Marcus thought about Julian at the engagement party, at ease, laughing. He thought about the bracelet on Vivian's wrist. He thought, you needed her in the structure because a compliant shareholder who would not scrutinize the accounts gave you runway. How long were you planning this? Did you pick her, or did it simply become convenient? He did not say any of this. He thanked Devlin, shook his hand, and left. He called Patricia from the street. It's worse than I thought, he said. How much worse? He gave her the summary in 3 sentences. She was quiet for a moment. All right. I'm moving the Ashford documentation to Elkins and our securities litigation team. This is not just a corporate matter. Depending on how we characterize the self-dealing transaction, there may be a securities fraud component. I want you to let me manage the sequencing from here. I know. The engagement? He stopped walking for a moment, on the edge of a crosswalk, a delivery bike moving past him in the bike lane. End it, he said. Today. When I get home tonight. Do you want documentation prepared? No, I want it clean. I'll return the ring. Whatever she wants from the apartment she can arrange to collect within 48 hours. I'll be somewhere else. All right. Patricia paused. Marcus, he's going to figure out what's coming when we file. I know, that's fine. By the time he figures it out, the filings will be in order, and the preliminary injunction on the Red Hook position will have been requested. He won't be able to move anything. And the firm. The firm is fine. He's COO, not a principal shareholder. His removal does not require a shareholder vote. It's within my authority as founding principal under the management provisions. I'll have his termination ready to deliver simultaneously with the legal filing. You've thought this through. I think things through, Marcus said. It's the only thing I consistently do. He crossed the street. He took the subway home rather than a car because he wanted the 30 minutes of underground noise and motion, the specific texture of the city underground, the flickering lighting in the older stations, the smell of recycled air and metal, and the accumulated density of millions of daily passages. He stood holding the overhead bar as the train moved, and let the noise be around him without resisting it. He had been with Vivian for 3 years. He had proposed 9 months ago on a Tuesday evening in October at a restaurant they both liked, with a reservation that was not otherwise notable, because he had decided against the elaborate gesture and toward the sincere one, the ordinary evening, the real question. She had said yes and cried, which had moved him, which he acknowledged had moved him genuinely. He had believed something about her. He was not a man who said the word love carelessly. Danhai. He understood it had specific weight, and he had applied it deliberately. He thought about that now, standing in the moving train, and found that the feeling it produced was not grief exactly, not yet, but something compressed and dense, and waiting for a moment he did not have yet, a moment that was not tonight and not tomorrow, but that existed somewhere ahead of him in the future, when all the structural work was done and the legal processes were concluded, and he could be somewhere quiet and allow the thing to open. Not yet. He got home at 6:42. Vivian was in the kitchen, which was small and warm and smelled of whatever she was heating. Pasta, he thought. Something with tomato. She was on the phone with her sister, and she held up a finger when he came in, a give-me-a-minute gesture. And he nodded and set his bag down on the bench by the door, and went to the kitchen sink and washed his hands, which was a habit. Won't worry. He stood at the sink and looked at his hands under the water. He thought, I have to tell her the truth because she deserves to know the actual reason, even if the actual reason is going to be awful for both of us. He had debated this with himself for days. He could end the engagement without revealing what he knew. He could manufacture a reason, or simply say he had reconsidered, which was in a technical sense true. But it would leave her with a false story. And the false story would follow her, and she would construct a narrative around it that was not accurate. And he found he could not sustain that level of dishonesty even in service of the cleaner legal strategy. He had decided he would tell her what he knew. He would not tell her about the legal proceedings. She would learn about those through other channels, but he would tell her about the bracelet and what it meant to him, and he would let her respond however she responded. She came off the phone at 7:15 and turned down whatever was on the stove and came into the living room where he was sitting, not on his phone, which was unusual enough that she noticed. You look different, she said. Sit down, he said. Her face changed. She sat on the edge of the couch across from him and looked at him with an alertness that told him she had been waiting, on some level, for something. People who are keeping secrets develop a background alertness. Chuat, a low-grade bracing against the moment of discovery. He recognized it now, retroactively. He had seen it in small moments over recent months and attributed it to work stress. The bracelet you wore to the engagement party, he said. The platinum one with the sapphire clasp. I need you to tell me where it came from. She did not say anything for a long moment. Marcus. Where it came from, he said again, not raising his voice, not changing his expression. She looked at her hands, none, which were in her lap, and he watched the various calculations move through her face, the options, the stories, the angles of approach. He gave her the time to work through them. She deserved that. When she looked up, her eyes were very bright. I know this looks like... I know exactly what it is, he said. I held that piece in my hands at Ferretti & Sons 8 months ago. I know the production number. I know what it costs. I know I didn't buy it, and I know you weren't wearing it before this. I've known since the night of the party. I am not asking you to explain what it is. I'm asking you to acknowledge it. She closed her eyes. How long? He said. She pressed her lips together. 14 months. He absorbed that. 14 months. The Red Hook LP agreement had been entered 14 months ago. He would not say this to her because it would reveal what he knew about the financial structure, but the synchronicity was interesting. "I'm ending the engagement," he said. "I'd like the ring back tonight. I'll arrange to have your things, everything that's in this apartment that belongs to you. I'll have them ready for collection on Saturday. I'll be in Boston with my mother through the weekend. You'll have the apartment to yourself during that time." She opened her eyes. There were tears, which were real, and he acknowledged them internally without changing what he was doing. "Marcus," she said, "I know that nothing I say—" "You're right," he said. "There's nothing to say right now that would be useful to either of us. I'm not angry." This was partially true. "I don't want this to be destructive for either of us beyond what's necessary. I'm asking for the ring and a clean exit." She reached up and took the pendant from her throat first, the wrong piece, the one he had given her 6 weeks ago, and placed it on the coffee table. Then she removed the ring. She held it for a moment. Then she set it beside the pendant on the coffee table. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice was very small, and it was the most honest she had sounded in the conversation. He picked up the ring and the pendant. He stood up. He went to the study and stayed there until he heard her leave. She went out around 9, footsteps and the soft close of the front door. And then he went and turned off the stove where the pasta had dried against the sides of the pot. And he threw it out and rinsed the pot and set it in the drying rack. He called his mother and told her he was coming to Boston. She did not ask for details. She said the guest room was always made up. He flew the following morning, a 6 a.m. flight, and he sat in a window seat with a bad coffee from the terminal and watched the city get small below him and then disappear into cloud cover. And he felt the thing that had been waiting try to open, and he let it open a small amount, not all the way. Because he was on a plane and surrounded by strangers, and he was not a man who let things open in full in environments he did not control, but he let some of it through. It was bad. It was specifically bad in the way that things are bad when they involve a version of yourself that had believed something and has now stopped. He finished the bad coffee. He looked at clouds. He arrived in Boston, and his mother was at the door of her house in Beacon Hill, which was narrow and warm, and smelled of old books and the particular tea she had made every morning since he was a child. She looked at his face and said nothing, which was the correct response. She brought him tea. They sat in the front sitting room, and he told her what had happened. Not all of it, but the essential shape. She listened. She was a composed woman, his mother, a former appellate attorney who had moved into academic law and then into retirement without ever losing the quality of measured clarity she brought to things. When he finished, she said, "Do you need me to be angry on your behalf?" "No," he said. "Good, I'm not going to be." She looked at him steadily. "I'll ask you the question Patricia probably already asked you." She did. "And your answer?" "I said both," he said. "Strategy and what I actually feel." His mother nodded. "That's an honest answer." She set her teacup down. "The company is going to be fine." "Yes." "And you will be fine." "Eventually." "Yes, eventually." She looked at him with the directness she had always used, even when he was a child, which had sometimes been difficult and was always, in retrospect, correct. "Take the weekend. You can be human here. Then go back and finish what you're doing." He stayed until Sunday evening. He was human in the modest way that he could manage. He slept past 6 once, which was 6:40, which his mother found moderately amusing. He walked through the neighborhood in the cold, the kind of Boston February cold that came up through the sidewalk and had texture and weight to it. He ate breakfast at a diner around the corner that had fluorescent lighting and a cracked menu laminate and excellent eggs. And he sat there for an hour both mornings, reading nothing. To what? Thinking with less structure than usual. He thought about Julian. He tried to understand whether the anger at Julian was greater than the specific pain of Vivian, and he found that the two things were almost entirely separate. That the Vivian pan was its own quiet room, and the Julian thing was something else, colder and more deliberate, less like an emotion and more like a set of facts that had a direct consequence. Julian had systematically stolen from the firm. Julian had used a relationship with Vivian as part of a structural arrangement that gave him cover. Julian had sat across from Marcus in meetings for years, had eaten at his table, had stood at his engagement party, and had operated throughout all of it with the ease of a man who did not believe he would ever be found out. Marcus thought about the Lange and Sohne on Julian's wrist. He thought about the Verbier apartment. He thought about the monthly retainers to a non-existent advisory firm flowing for 36 months. He felt something that he recognized as contempt, which was a clean feeling compared to some of the others. On Sunday evening, he flew back. He went directly from the airport to the apartment, which was quiet and different. Vivian had taken what she needed, which was efficiently done, and the remaining space had the slightly altered quality of any space from which something has been removed. Not empty, but differently occupied. He sent one email from the airport lounge. To Patricia, ready to proceed on full sequencing. Advise when simultaneous filings are ready. She responded in 11 minutes, Monday morning, 9 a.m., Thorn Capital and the SEC simultaneously. Termination letter ready for your signature. He responded, confirmed. He slept well. Thandan, which was not something he would have predicted, and which he took as a sign that the decision had been the right one in the deepest operational sense, not just strategically correct, but something his body recognized as aligned. At 9 a.m. on Monday, Patricia Sung's office delivered a package to Thorn Capital's registered legal address, initiating formal civil proceedings against Julian Ashford for breach of fiduciary duty, self-dealing, and fraudulent misappropriation of fund assets. Simultaneously, a disclosure was filed with the SEC through the firm's compliance channel, flagging the suspected securities violation in the Red Hook co-investment structure. The preliminary injunction request, which froze Julian's interest in Meridian Parallel Holdings pending the investigation, was filed in state court. At 9:04, Marcus walked into Julian's office. Julian was at his desk, jacket on, coffee in hand, looking at his screen. He looked up when Marcus came in. There was a half-second in which nothing moved. Then his phone rang. He looked at it. It was, Marcus presumed, either his own attorney or someone at the Red Hook development notifying him that something had been frozen. Julian looked at the phone. He looked at Marcus. Marcus said, "I'd encourage you to answer that. You're going to want to get ahead of the timeline." Julian's face went through several expressions in the space of 2 seconds. Marcus watched them. Surprise, which was real. Calculation, which was immediate. Something that might have been the beginning of an argument or an attempt at explanation. And then, smoothing over all of it, a controlled stillness, which Marcus recognized because he used it himself. Julian answered the phone. Marcus left and closed the door quietly behind him and went to Elena's desk. "Please make sure building security has Mr. Ashford's access card on the revocation list as of close of business today," he said aloud. "And pull together the offboarding sequence for an executive-level departure. HR will handle the formal communication. This is internal sequencing only." Elena looked at him for a moment. She was not a person who asked questions when he used a particular tone. "Of course," she said. He went to his own office and closed his door, and sat at his desk and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows, which was, in the late morning light on a clear February day, very bright and very flat and very real. He thought, "It has begun." The proceedings moved over the following months with the specific rhythm of institutional legal process. Not fast, not dramatic, but inexorable. Devlin's forensic report became the evidentiary backbone of the civil case. Julian hired a white shoe defense firm, which was expected, and the defense attempted initially to characterize the self-dealing transaction as a disclosure oversight rather than intentional misconduct, which was the standard first move and was not particularly persuasive given the evidence of the Delaware nominee structure. The SEC inquiry moved in parallel and was, by design, beyond Marcus's direct control. Once a disclosure is made, the regulatory process runs independently. He followed it through Patricia's updates and through the dry language of periodic filings. Julian Ashford resigned from Thorn Capital 31 days after the proceedings began, under the terms of a negotiated separation that required the resignation in exchange for certain litigation concessions that Patricia had structured deliberately, not out of mercy, but because the resignation served the firm's operational stability better than a contested removal process that would have created noise for clients. The day the resignation was confirmed, Marcus sat in his office at 6 in the evening and looked at the city, which was going dark, and felt the specific release of a concluded process, not celebration, something quieter, the satisfaction of a thing correctly done. He left the office at 6:30 and walked to a small restaurant near the office that he liked, narrow, dimly lit, with worn wooden tables and a wine list that was excellent but not performatively so. He had a table in the corner that he used occasionally when he wanted to eat alone without the texture of eating alone at home, which was different. He ordered pasta and a glass of Barolo and ate without his phone out, which was unusual for him, and he was aware that he was deliberately practicing the thing his mother had told him to do, to be human when the work permitted it. The restaurant had a particular sound in the evening, the overlapping soft conversations of nearby tables, the gentle percussion of kitchen sounds from behind the service door, a low musical ambient layer that was not intrusive. He sat inside this sound and ate, and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of skill. At the table adjacent to his, slightly behind and to his left, a woman laughed at something. A brief, real laugh, the kind that catches people by surprise and is over before they can modulate it, not a social laugh. He did not look up. He heard her say something to whoever was with her in a voice that was low and precise, and the voice itself had a quality that he noticed without intending to. It was a voice that sounded like someone who said what they meant. He looked at the wine in his glass. He did not look over. He stayed for another 20 minutes and paid and left. On the street outside, he stood for a moment in the cold and the noise of the city in the early evening, and he thought, eventually. His mother had said eventually, and she was right. He began to rebuild, not dramatically, rebuilding. In the functional sense, was not a dramatic activity. It was a series of decisions made in the correct order with the correct information, executed with appropriate patience. He hired a new COO, a woman named Rachel Kwan, who had run operations at a larger fund, and who had, in his assessment, a structural intelligence that was even more precise than Julian's had been, and was not, as far as he could determine, accompanied by Julian's particular form of self-interest. He restructured the discretionary transaction authority so that no single executive below him held unilateral approval above $2,000 on any account. He commissioned an independent annual audit structure with a firm that rotated every 3 years to prevent the kind of comfortable familiarity that had allowed Julian to operate undetected. He rebuilt the equity structure to remove the marriage-triggered transfer provisions entirely. This was not legally required. The engagement had ended and the provisions were moot, but he removed them as a matter of operational philosophy. The company would transfer equity through mechanisms tied to performance and contribution, not domestic arrangements. The Red Hook development was ultimately restructured when the injunction on Julian's Meridian parallel position was litigated through. Thorn Capital's LP interest was not affected. The development completed on schedule 18 months later, and returned 21% to its limited partners, which was in the middle of the projected range. Marcus tracked this without particular emotion. It was a fund position. It returned what it was supposed to return. The civil case settled 14 months after filing. The settlement was confidential in its terms, as most civil settlements are, but Patricia sent him a 2-sentence summary. The recovery was substantial, and the non-disclosure agreement Julian signed was comprehensive. Julian Ashford left New York. Marcus did not track where he went. Vivian Cole Marcus saw once, approximately 8 months after the engagement ended, from a distance of half a block. She was with someone, a tall man, and they were walking and talking, and she looked well. Her hair was different, shorter, and she moved with the same energy he had always associated with her working phases. She did not see him. He crossed to the other side of the street, not because he needed to avoid her, but because the situation did not require an encounter, and he was a man who did not produce unnecessary situations. He thought about her for approximately 30 seconds after that, and then stopped. The restaurant with the worn wooden tables and the excellent Barolo became, over subsequent months, a thing he did once a week. It was not a ritual exactly. He was resistant to rituals for their own sake, but he found that the particular texture of the place, its sound and its unhurried quality, provided something that his apartment did not, and that his office certainly did not. He was there on a Wednesday in October, 11 months after the engagement ended, when the woman from the adjacent table was at the same table again. He recognized her voice first. She was at the table to his left again, and she was alone this time, and she was reading something on her phone while she waited for whatever she'd ordered, and she made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family as one. The sound of someone who has read something that they found genuinely interesting. He looked up. She was in her early 30s. Dark coat over what looked like a work outfit. She had come directly from somewhere, as he usually did. So, she had a quality of self-containment that he recognized and valued, the quality of someone comfortable occupying space without filling it unnecessarily. She looked up, not at him, but in the general direction of the kitchen, looking for the waiter, and he looked back at his wine. He ate his dinner. As he was paying, she caught his eye briefly across the small distance between the tables. Accidental? The way eyes meet in close quarters. And she gave the small acknowledgement of adjacent table strangers a half nod, and he returned it, and she looked back at her food. He put his coat on. He left. Outside on the street, he stood again in the cold for a moment. He thought, Wednesday? She comes on Wednesday. So do I. He thought about whether to file that as relevant information. He thought about the way she had laughed when he hadn't been looking. He walked home through the city, Tarnensar, which was cold and bright and loud in the specific way of a Wednesday evening, and he thought about the conversation he'd had with Devlin in the rented conference room. The gray suit, the closed folder, the plain language of findings that had restructured the subsequent 14 months of his life. He thought about the morning after the engagement party, 5:15, the encrypted folder, the subdirectory he'd named Thorn Capital, restructuring, which had been, in retrospect, a useful fiction, a name for something that was larger than a company and that he had not had another name for at the time. He thought about his mother's front sitting room, the tea, the question she had asked. He thought, I am going to be fine. Not eventually. He corrected his mother in his mind, gently, respectfully. Not eventually. Now. In the specific present of this Wednesday evening on this city street in this particular cold, with the particular sound of the city around him and the Barolo correctly in his system, and the knowledge that the company was structurally sound, and Rachel Kwan was a better operational partner than Julian had ever been, and the civil case was settled, and the regulatory matter was resolved. Now. He kept walking. He went back the following Wednesday. She was there. He took the table next to hers again, which was the corner table he always took, so there was nothing conspicuous in it. He ordered wine. He ordered pasta, which is what he always ordered. He read through a report on his phone with less concentration than usual. After about 20 minutes, she said, without preamble, addressing the air somewhere between them, "Do you always eat alone here?" He looked up. She was looking at him with an expression that was direct and not unkind. "Most weeks," he said. "You?" "Most Wednesdays," she said. "I come here after my late meeting ends." He nodded. "Marcus," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Lena." She had a quality he had not encountered frequently, the quality of not filling silence with unnecessary content, which meant that when she spoke, the content was signal rather than noise. They talked for perhaps 20 minutes, across the small space between their tables, not moving chairs or combining tables, which would have been premature. They talked about the restaurant, about the neighborhood, about what they each did, Thalmar, which she described as financial forensics, institutional side, and which made him look at her with a specific attention that was new. "Forensic accounting," he said. "Adjacent," she said. "I work for a firm that provides expert witness services in securities and asset litigation. I read ledgers for a living." He thought about Devlin in the gray suit. He thought about the Red Hook side letter buried in the LP agreement. "I've worked with people in that area," he said. "It's a small world," she said. And there was something in the way she said it, not cynically, just factually, that he found accurate and correct. They paid their separate checks. Outside on the street, she pulled her coat closed and said, "I'll probably be here next Wednesday." "I probably will too," he said. She nodded and walked toward the subway entrance on the corner. He watched her for a moment and then turned and walked in the opposite direction, for he did not examine the feeling with too much precision. He had learned something about himself in the previous year, that he had a tendency to over-document and over-analyze internal states, to treat them like positions that needed to be managed, and that this was sometimes useful and sometimes a way of avoiding them. He was trying, with moderate success, to let the things that were not strategic simply be what they were. This was something that was not strategic. He let it be what it was. He walked home through the city, which was cold and dark, and very much itself, and he thought about what the next year would look like. The fund's next close, the second phase of the Red Hook exit, the board seats he was considering for the following fiscal year. He thought about Rachel Kwan's proposal for an expansion of the advisory vertical, which had merit. He thought about the Boston house and his mother in it, and the cracked laminate menu at the diner around the corner. He thought about a woman who read ledgers for a living and came to the restaurant on Wednesdays. He thought about how the city looked from his office in the mornings, that specific February quality of flat, bright light. He opened his phone. He sent an email to Patricia Sung's office. "Please close the Thorn Capital. Restructuring file and archive per standard protocol. All active matters concluded." He put his phone in his pocket. He kept walking.